Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome your moderator for People Impacted by Climate Change, Raj Pandya.
So thank you very much for spending some time with us this afternoon. I'm going to modify the title a little bit and not talk about people impacted by climate change, but talk about people who have an opportunity and are our partners in dealing with climate change. This session is around exploring what that partnership can look like and how scientists and community leaders and stakeholders and community members can work together to do science in a new kind of way, a way that sort of separates and builds on, separates ourselves from, but builds on the way we've done science in the past, that takes all of the wonderful things about science and adds to it a kind of collaboration and practical orientation that I think we need in order to really rise up to the challenges that we face in the next 100 years. I think about it as a kind of science that we can add to our portfolio of science as we tackle the challenges of the next 100 years. In that context, we're going to do something a little bit different, which is acknowledge some of the past. There's a tradition in many indigenous cultures called a land acknowledgement. It can be a step towards reconciliation, and so I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement. This meeting is held on the unceded territory, which are the original homelands of the Ohlone peoples and the coastal Miwok. This land has a rich indigenous history. California was once home to over 300 Native American dialects and as many as 90 different languages. Today, this land has a rich indigenous presence. The Bay Area is currently home to one of the largest populations of indigenous peoples in the United States, and California continues to be a home for 200 tribes. As a society of earth and space science, we recognize and welcome the scientific knowledge embodied in the practice and traditions of indigenous peoples in the Bay Area and around the globe. Indigenous peoples actively interact with and care for landscapes in ways that enhance biodiversity, ecological stability, and resilience. In acknowledging the land, the history of the land, and the knowledge of the people who have lived and still live with those lands, we also pledge to welcome and grant rightful place to Indigenous voices, to stand in solidarity with local Indigenous communities, and to learn and respect local Indigenous protocols. This is going to be a discussion, and so I'm going to introduce each of our panelists, start off with a question for each of them, and I'm hoping that you'll have your own questions. So as you do, just raise your hand. Donna is around with a mic, and she'll be able to sort of come up to you and help you. So it'll be maybe a couple minutes before we open it up to audience questions, but you might be thinking about what question you want to ask. So our three panelists in order, sitting next to me is Dominique David Chavez. Dominique is a postdoctoral research in the Department of Forest and Rangeland Stewardship at Colorado State University. She's also a Native Nations Institute National Science Foundation postdoctoral fellow at the Udall Center for Studies in Public Policy at the University of Arizona. And in these positions, she's guiding an Indigenous Data Stewards Research Group, which is conducting a national study on the ethics and protocols for conducting research with Indigenous communities and on Indigenous lands. She also supports community-based climate resilience research and education with her own Indigenous community in the Caribbean. She's developed, collaboratively, a thoughtful set of questions that agencies can use to anchor their work with Indigenous communities in genuine collaboration. And in past AGU meetings, she's presented a meta-analysis of climate studies that have been conducted with Indigenous communities. Sitting next to her is Professor Karim Ali Kassam, who is an international professor of environmental and Indigenous studies in the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences at Cornell University. He's also an associate professor in the Department of Natural Resources and the American Indian and Indigenous Studies program. Dr. Kassam's research, Karim's research, projects are based on action research approaches in which the community directly participates in the design, implementation, and application of results. He's done work with communities around the world, including the circumpolar Arctic, the Pamir Mountains of Central Asia, the Northern Plains, and in upstate New York. He's written thoughtfully about the responsibilities that come with the privilege of doing research. And sitting next to Karim is Alvaro Sanchez. He's the Environmental Equity Director at the Greenlining Institute. The Greenlining Institute is a policy research, organizing, and leadership institute working for racial and economic justice. They work on major policy issues from economy to environmental policy, healthcare, and many others because, as they say on their website, they don't see these issues as being in separate silos, but as interconnected threads in a web of opportunity. Mr. Sanchez is an urban planner who's led work on SB 535, which is a new legislation in the state of California that directs at least 1/4 of California's greenhouse gas reduction fund to disadvantaged communities. He's also led neighborhood-scale sustainability initiatives and developed comprehensive and scalable approach to greenhouse gas reductions that leverage private and public investment while improving access for underserved communities throughout California. So please join me in welcoming the panelists. And I'll start off with our first question, which is simply to ask each of you to tell us a little bit about the communities you work with and what makes them unique.
Mabrika Dominic Aita Inaru David Chavez Diri Boriken Arawak Hiwaro Taino Daka Hahom Guaitia. So that's who I am, and I said, welcome to you all. Welcome, thank you for coming here, and thank you to Raj and the AGU community and to my fellow panelists for inviting me to share my work. I'm also sharing some of our indigenous language of the Caribbean with you. This is the 100th year celebration, and there's a lot that's gone on in the past 100 and 500 years on these lands. And so I've learned to just ground myself in our language and share it as a way of inspiring and regenerating our indigenous languages and the practices and the knowledges also embedded and tied with them. So I'm grateful that I was invited to do that here. And I work with many communities, but I am accountable to my family's community, to my cultural community. And so a lot of the work that I've been doing since coming back to college and working as a climate researcher has been with rural indigenous island communities in the Caribbean. And so I'll speak a lot to community-based research in those areas. I also work with the indigenous scholars community, so working with these incredible rising scholars that are very culturally grounded in their work, that are building their capacity to be leaders in environmental sciences. So I'll speak some to that community as well. And then with my work with Native Nations Institute, I work more regionally in the Southwest and some of our arid communities, working on indigenous governance and indigenous data governance and research.
Thank you. Karim?
Wonderful. I work with indigenous and rural communities at high latitudes and high altitudes. And at the high latitudes, I work in the Russian, Alaskan, or the American, and the Canadian Arctic and the boreal forest. And at high altitudes, I work in the Pamir Mountains of Central Asia, and specifically Afghanistan, the Kyrgyz Republic, the Tajik Republic, and Xinjiang, which, as you know, is currently under China. And so those are the regions of the world where I work. And these regions, the question was, who do you work with? And the operative word is with, because our research is participatory. So either they have invited us to work with them, as in the Russian Arctic, or we have thought about something and we have gone to them and asked them if they would like to collaborate with us, and we could do this. So it is about participatory work. And the other part of the question was, how are they unique? And they're unique in a number of ways. They're unique because of the history of colonialism and imperialism and the effects of cultural genocide. And this is continuing now, as you must be watching the news and learning about what's happening in Central Asia. These are regions, because of that colonization, where there is structural poverty. So it's not about pulling oneself up by one's own bootstrings. It's about how the structures continue poverty. These are also, if you think about the high latitude and high altitude communities I described to you, these are also the frontiers of the Cold War that have been reconceptualized as the clash of civilizations. But I've talked about what is negative. But these areas are also, these communities have agency. Both the land has agency and the communities that live on that land have agency. And what do I mean by that? I mean, these regions are rich in biological and are rich in cultural diversity. These lands are pregnant with renewable and non-renewable resources. And this is one of the reasons why people want to invade them. In these regions, there are different ecological professions. So herder, fisher, farmer, hunter, orchardist, tourism. And within these ecological professions, they're still fundamentally part of the 21st century. They're not outside of time. They're part of this global economy. And because of this history, because of surviving this history, and because of their ecological and cultural diversity, these regions are rich in different ways of knowing. So that's why I work with them, and that's why they're unique.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Buenas tardes. My name is Alvaro Sanchez. And the communities that I work with are communities in California that are first and worst hit by the effects of climate change, and who often, due to a history of policy decisions, have been placed at a severe disadvantage in their opportunity to respond to an ecological crisis, to a democratic crisis, and an economic crisis, all of which they are feeling the brunt of at the same time. So these are communities like Stockton, California, one of the first cities in the whole country to file for bankruptcy, only to be kind of followed by Detroit. These are communities like East Palo Alto, who are whose neighbors are Facebook, Google, and Apple, yet suffer from severe challenges dealing with climate change and sea level rise, but also severe housing shortages that put them at risk from displacement and gentrification. These are communities like Wilmington down in Los Angeles, who are neighbors to the Port of Los Angeles and the Port of Long Beach, and suffer from severe impacts from emissions generated by an ever-increasing freight sector that is taking on this new kind of e-commerce that everyone is contributing to increasing. And these are communities like down in the border, communities that are heavily impacted by pollution generated on the Mexican side of the border, and yet have to contend with having to figure out how to deal with that kind of impact from an ecological perspective, but also from an economic perspective. So these are the communities that are at the brunt of everything that we're dealing with in terms of climate change and in terms of our economy. And the work that I do is trying to figure out how to address both poverty and pollution at the same time, because these communities are not dealing with just one kind of crisis. They're dealing with an accumulation of crises that have been generated through many decades and centuries of policy decisions that have put them at the brunt of all of these different pressures at the same time.
Building on that a little bit, one of the things I worry about sometimes as a scientist is there's kind of a pervasive idea of a deficit, that these communities need scientific help. So I want to turn that on its head and ask you, what strengths do the communities that you work with bring to this conversation about climate or this action around climate? Please.
So one thing I'm always reminded of is that these community members are our first scientists. And we've had scientists in our communities for a long time before we were using that word in English as it's used today. We had knowledge keepers. And I like to think of it this way. I worked in Boriquen, which is our original name for Puerto Rico, an area heavily impacted by climate extremes, and Quisqueya, which is the original name for Dominican Republic. And our rural farmers in those areas, they've been observing and passing down knowledge about the soils, about atmospheric changes, about the land, about climate adaptation for centuries, for millennia in many indigenous communities. And so I think about that. These are longitudinal studies over the course of that time where that knowledge was handed down in all different forms of data. And that data was passed down to these first scientists, who many continue it today, not just for publication and award or anything along these lines, but for the survival of their people and the well-being of their family. It was held with reverence, and it is held with value by those scientists, as I would call them, our community scientists, our indigenous scientists. So within those knowledge systems, within all those forms of data, those stories, those practices that are so intentionally and thoughtfully applied in practice, each of those communities has so much to offer us. And here in what's now the US alone, we have 573 federally recognized tribal nations. And that's not including state recognized and non-federally recognized, such as US territories like my own community, each of them holding their own unique knowledge system about that land over that long course of time. So you can only imagine how much strength there is within that knowledge, those practices, and the value systems that maintain them and hand them down for the well-being of generations.
Kareem?
So I want to build on that idea. The grand questions that we face in the third millennium are questions where I can't turn around and go to a community and say, "Hi, I'm from Cornell and I'm here to help." The fundamental questions that we're facing, whether it be climate change, whether it be structural poverty, or whether in the third millennium still we have not been able to address equality or equity across genders or across different cultures, still in the third millennium. These are grand questions. And to respond to these issues, expertise is not sufficient. And I'm conscious of the fact that I'm addressing mainly physical scientists who tend to be empirical and quantitative. So imagine in your mind a mountain range of optimalities. A mountain range of optimalities. I work in mountains. And every time we reach an optimality and we look out, we find that there is another optimality and that we need to work to reach that optimality. And as soon as we reach there, we find, oh, there is a valley and there is yet another optimality. I know I sound theoretical, but think of DDT. Perfect, enough for us to control malaria. Perfect for protecting our populations. And yet we watched the impact it had on our habitat, on raptors, and so on. Think of chlorofluorocarbons. Perfect for a cold beer on a hot summer's day. Perfect for keeping our food. An inert molecule, no problem. We can work with this. Until we discovered what it was doing to the ozone, and now we have some good news. But each time, we came back to respond to it collaboratively. And one way of thinking, one way of knowing was not sufficient. And so why are these communities important? So for me, the case has already been made by Dominique, the importance of indigenous communities, because there's a historical record of empirical knowledge that is passed down. And tradition doesn't mean calcified or fossilized. It literally means in Latin, handing down. And each time you hand something down, it's modified, it's dynamic, and it's changed. But I discovered something really interesting. In 2016, I started, actually, since 2008, I started working with grade 5 and grade 6 kids. And I haven't been telling my colleagues at Cornell that we've been doing this, although we've been publishing it. And at Cornell and in New York State, these kids in these rural areas are considered poor, according to the state of New York. And we were looking at their knowledge of science and engineering. Grade 5 and grade 6, rural kids that the state of New York considers poor, i.e. deficit. And these were not indigenous kids. They were Euro-American kids, or to use the phrase that they use here in the United States, they were nice white folks. And so we started working with these kids, and in 2016, we also started working at Lake Oneida, in a region that has questions about climate change and voted for a particular leader that's in charge today. So there was a fundamental difference in our outlooks. It is stunning, the level of science and engineering that grade 5 and grade 6 children have because of their connection to their habitat. It is profoundly rich. These people that seem like outsiders have such a profound understanding of their habitat as herders and farmers, as Euro-American settler communities. So it is stunning the level of knowledge that we humans have. And so the point I want to make is that this is true of indigenous communities, and it is also true of humanity, so long as we have commitment to that space and to that land.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to echo the same sentiment. In urban environments, which is the one that I work on the most, how many of you, just by a show of hands, know about the policy called redlining? Okay, so a little bit less than a third of the room. Redlining was a federal policy that allowed people to purchase homes by being underwritten by the federal government. And in the process of doing that, this was during the Great Depression, in the process of doing that, the federal government, along with real estate companies and banks, developed maps. And those maps identified what communities were more appropriate for those investments based on certain criteria. A green map meant very good investment area. A yellow meant kind of okay, kind of declining. A red line community meant definitely declining, don't invest there, and banks don't give loans to the people that live in that community. The number one factor why those red line communities were red was because people of color lived there. So about 98% of the federal backed loans for home purchasing, which is the way that most people in the US build their wealth, were given to white people in the country, right? So that policy and the impact of that policy has meant that in many of these communities, they became kind of the dumping ground for a lot of toxic facilities, a lot of our transportation network, and it kind of baked in a level of poverty into those communities that those people have had to deal with for many generations. The result of that is that due to the pollution that they were being exposed to, many of the folks who lived in those communities have become on their own kind of, self-made scientists. Folks who have had to study levels of lead in their water, levels of asthma that their kids are experiencing, the types of pollution due to brownfields and they're abandoning. So I know of many communities throughout the United States that have, on their own, developed a scientific knowledge that is kind of a wasted opportunity for many of us that are working on more accredited research. So I really encourage folks to think of those communities and the their capacities that they've built on their own to be brought into this space as collaborators, as partners, because there's rich knowledge due to the fact that on their own they had to develop the types of research to prove that they were indeed being exposed to higher levels of pollution due to the circumstances upon which they were living in. So there's a lot of ingenuity, a lot of scrappiness, and there's a lot of really good science being done in these communities out of necessity. So if that could be leveraged towards achieving the goals that you all have in terms of a scientific community, I think that that's a really good way to be thinking about turning a deficit community into an opportunity community moving forward.
Alvaro and Dominique, I have a friend named Dan Wildcat who says, building on what you just talked about ingenuity, he calls it indigenuity. So, what kind of questions do you have in the audience? All the way in the back.
So I'm pretty interested in research that shows that public opinion is driven more by narrative than by fact. And so how would you advise members of the scientific community to help share the narrative of climate change and the people that it affects, as opposed to just sharing facts about climate change and the people it affects?
It's a great question. Can I start? That's a great question. I would say for scientists to seek out cultural brokers, and artists are actually fantastic cultural brokers to science. There's a group in the Bay Area called Culture Strike, and Culture Strike has been heavily involved in climate messaging. It's not that science and facts don't win the day, it's just that you need to have an open ear towards those facts, and sometimes that's culture, right? Culturally appropriate messages, culturally appropriate messengers, and being able to leverage just what's in our popular culture today to allow folks to open their ears and their perspectives towards the facts that you're producing, I think it's a really powerful partnership. But as a wonk and as a policy advocate, I often am not the best messenger even to a community that I might represent because of how I look. So thinking about how to partner with those cultural brokers is actually, I think, really important. And sometimes something that we don't often think about, even in the work that I do. So we spend a lot of time working on narratives, working on making policy feel real for people, and striking those kinds of partnerships with cultural brokers.
Because of the nature of the work that we do, I have had to approach people that I may fundamentally disagree with on their perception or my perception of the facts. One of the most valuable things I have found is listening to their narrative, understanding their narrative. What does it emerge from? What are their concerns? What are their priorities? And what contribution they can make. So listening and also recognizing that they have agency, that they know things that I don't know, and that there are limitations to our research team, to our group of climate scientists, to our biologists and ecologists that are working with us. That's helped, and that has been key, simply listening and asking about their concerns, their priorities. The other thing is actually having a meal together. It's stunning what food can achieve. And sit down and consistently arrange a discussion around a meal. Our timeline of issues is tenure and when the grant runs out, which could be 3 or 5 years. There are not too many LTERs, right? So one of the things that a scholar who is involved in research has to do is that they have to return back to the community. So having a long-term relationship with a specific community, so it becomes a career commitment. Every year the students return, the professor returns, and so there is this long-term engagement, which is a genuine relationship. It's not an instrumental relationship. It's a different kind of a commitment. To use terse language, it is not a one-night stand. So some of these actions that are just fundamentally about relationships plays a long way in engaging the narrative. And as you know, narratives change. And I've watched over 3-4 years the nature of the conversation change. And the person who is putting forward a certain idea had argued the opposite just 3 years ago. So I think that these small factors, humility, listening, sustained relationship, are key and fundamental ingredients, which is exactly what we practice with our colleagues. I mean, everybody shows up year after year after year at the AGU to sustain those relationships while presenting their idea, right? It's not so much about your poster as it about the network that you're engaging. It's about that narrative.
I appreciate this question because I think it brings a lot of things together for me. I think about, I think as scientists, we've been working with an incomplete data set for a very long time. And we have told the story, but the story's been told from just this tiny handful of narratives, this tiny handful of knowledge bases, from few voices. And much of what the data that we see is missing all of these other stories, the lived experiences of the people on the ground. And so I appreciate Alvaro bringing to light about these community scientists, because those are the stories. Imagine the richness and the context of a story of a person whose well-being and livelihood depends on that data. The accountability they hold when monitoring that, the observation that they have every day, knowing how it's going to impact their lives and their families, their children, their grandchildren, their future generations that are coming. Those stories hold such richness that I don't think anyone else can communicate that. I work a lot. I am a researcher. I'm a community member, but I also think of myself as a facilitator. So if there is that primary source of data, that primary voice and story, I think a lot of our role is providing access for that to come behind the mic, to hand that mic to them. And there's so many innovative ways. We're also collaborating with community artists, one of whom I found on Instagram, just appreciating her artwork, to visualize the data, bringing that data back to community members and asking them, is this a meaningful way to communicate this data? There are so many opportunities, collaborating with filmmakers, with storytellers. And one thing that's important to remember is that data historically has come in many, many forms. We are all indigenous to some part of the world and had handed that knowledge down, had transmitted it in some form of data. And oftentimes that was through stories. So it's only this short period of time that we've maybe considered data to be this one thing, this almost single narrative, when really it's always been much more than that. It's just a matter of reconnecting to just the immense amount of pathways that there are to communicate what we're learning with each other.
Yes.
Thank you so much for this panel. I was in other things and I just felt really drawn to come and join you here. When I'm thinking about leveraging change, I think about like the root system of the trees that are in the image behind you, and connection and connectedness to the earth and connectedness to each other. And what came to my mind with the question and the invitation to inquire about your work is, are you working to connect these diverse, unique communities, unique indigenous communities and unique desperate communities across nations and across states and cultures so that they themselves can see their similarities with each other and recognize their inherent deeper connection with each other for leveraging a larger change at a global level with each other.
May I? Please. This is a good question. Connectivity has two aspects to it. It leverages, but it has another aspect. When you recognize connectivity, you inherently develop gratitude. But I won't go on that path. It's an important path, but I won't go on that path. I will stick to the path that you have outlined. So when addressing the issue that keeps me awake and has kept me awake for over 25 years has been this issue. What is the level, how is climate change being affected, being impacted and felt at the level of the village, at the level of a town? Because that's where I work. The communities that I work with are at the vanguard of climate change. They're Arctic communities and they're alpine communities, so they're at the vanguard. And they didn't cause it. So it's not a question of mitigation. They didn't, whatever behavioral change they engage in, it'll have no impact, no meaningful impact, because they didn't cause it. So it's a question of, one, anticipating the impacts of climate change, and two, a question of adaptation. It's also a question of justice, because they didn't cause this. And yet again, they're at the forefront of it. So we have been concerned about how do you anticipate climate change at the level of the village, and at the level of a town, or at the level of a valley. And we have been looking at ecological calendars. Now, what is wonderful about ecological calendars is that they are simultaneously universal, human, and very particular. They're grounded in the ecology and the culture. So, for example, the nascence of a flower, the appearance of an insect, the soundscape of birds, or ice breaking are key biophysical indicators of livelihood activity. Now we begin seeding, now we begin plowing, now we move the herd to higher pastures. And so the link between religious, socio-cultural, and ecological and biophysical events is intimate. And so we've been looking at these ecological calendars in Standing Rock, at Lake Oneida, amongst the European communities, Euro-American community that I was talking about, in the Pamir Mountains of Afghanistan, in the Pamir Mountains of Tajikistan, the Kyrgyz Republic, and in Xinjiang. So we're using this one very particular ecologically and culturally grounded mechanisms to then create a conversation across these communities. And what is interesting is that art is fundamental. The local artists actually design the icons for the various indicators that we are developing, the phenological indicators, that in fact we hope to present in 2020 on October 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, to be exact, our research findings in expressions of art, in terms of performance, as well as visual art, as a way of communicating our research findings while everybody is present. Now, why is this powerful? Why is this connectivity powerful? This wasn't our idea. We didn't come up with it. The Haudenosaunee, who are a confederacy in Northeast United States, and specifically in New York, Canada, and Quebec, the Haudenosaunee recognized about 15 years ago that the trees are walking, in the sense that there is a movement of the ecosystem. And so what they started doing is meeting with communities north of them and south of them to share with them information about their ecosystem, because the ecosystem is changing. And so they are now sharing information across international boundaries, across nations. When the Soviet Union collapsed, as usual, we were looking at the wrong part of the world. Our mind and our attention was focused elsewhere. But it was interesting to watch how indigenous communities in the mountain areas of Central Asia and in the Arctic came to the assistance of each other. So the Alaskan indigenous peoples sent assistance to the communities in the Chukotka Peninsula, in the Russian Arctic. And the Norwegian, in Norway, Sweden, and Finland, the Sami sent assistance to the Sami on the Kola Peninsula of Russia. And the nature of that assistance was fascinating. First, they sent emergency help. So there was no UN involved, there was no US aid involved, there was no Canadian International Development Agency involved. It was indigenous communities sending emergency assistance to other indigenous communities that could potentially starve to death and freeze to death after the collapse of the Soviet Union. The next level of assistance was they brought over indigenous peoples. Because of 70 years of communism, the knowledge of how to hunt and how to fish was suppressed. And so they trained hunters and fishers on the Alaskan side. And then they created a management program, a stewardship program, so that they would manage their gifts, their resources, thoughtfully. And here's the kicker of it all. You and I both know that the International Whaling Commission is made up of the very countries that took the whale stocks to extinction. That's who are the members of the International Whaling Commission. So it's like asking drug addicts to control consumption of drugs. But anyway, that's the reality of colonization. The Inupiaq on the North Slope of Alaska went to the International Whaling Commission and said, we hunt the bowhead whale, we have quotas to hunt the bowhead whale. But our neighbors on the Chukotka Peninsula traditionally hunt the gray whale. We're asking for just quotas to hunt 2 whales. We've already provided them the information, the equipment. We will match all the rules of the International Whaling Commission, but we will, if you allow them to hunt the gray whale, we will stave off starvation in the Arctic. And that requires a particular kind of humility and pragmatism to go to the very oppressor, ask permission, and then at the international level, receive it and prevent starvation in the Russian Arctic. So the question that you ask is amazing, because it is at the dawn of the 3rd millennium, it's happening. Second, it is about a different way of knowing. And third, it is powerful because no international institution was there in facilitating the connectivity. The indigenous communities did it on their own. That's powerful. That's about agency.
So I'm going to ask a question. Listening to this conversation, I'm sort of feeling like maybe a little guilty as a scientist. Science has been complicit in some pretty awful stuff, and there's a history here that we need to acknowledge. What else? What else can a scientist, a scientific institution, what else can the process of science do to move forward from this place?
I love this question, so thank you for asking this question. I'm going to answer it both from the space mindset of being a scientist myself, being implicit as a scientist, and also as a community member. And the duality of working through that is what led me here today. And so, what I'm really finding, it's something I observed as an indigenous community member first, and then had to wrap my head around as a scientist. What I'm observing is, we're at such an incredible time right now. We're finally seeing this formal recognition and acknowledgement of the value of local and indigenous knowledge systems and the communities who maintain them for example, from the IPCC for climate adaptation and human security for all of humankind, the value for all of humankind of these community members. So there's this huge push. And now, just in the last few years, this diversity, inclusion, and equity, you hear this language all the time, but what does that mean and why are we using it? Why do we have to hold special sessions on this topic? And there's a historical context there. So what I see happening still, I have research data about it, it's a big part of the work that I do in the scientific community, is this surface push to get diverse voices in or to access that knowledge, to see the value of it, but not addressing those underlying drivers that led us to where we are today. Not acknowledging them or understanding, not learning about them, or even teaching our children about them. The curriculum that my children access is a colonial assimilationist curriculum in school. They don't learn about that they are people of this land, about their languages, about the value of their knowledge contributions to the sciences even. And it's perpetuated at every stage from the elementary education all the way up to the highest levels in our careers and institutions. And so how are we doing if we're working to engage and acknowledge that, but not addressing the rights, the human rights and indigenous rights frameworks that are, the resources are there. We have the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples, to which almost all of our nations are signatory at this point, that we also would hold obligations as scientists. But I rarely ever hear that in the discussion and conversation today. I'll hear the topic of, oh, we need to engage diverse voices, we need to get this knowledge into the work that we're doing, but not how are we addressing indigenous rights? How are we addressing and acknowledging the land that we stand on and the legacy that has brought us to where we are today? We're all working through a history in any of the colonized nations, including where we are today, of genocide, of slavery, to which my family is only 3 generations removed. We're all working through that legacy. If we're not talking about it and getting at the underlying factors and drivers, then what are we really doing? And I think the science community, as any community of practice, has the responsibility and hopefully the integrity and the humility to address that, regardless of how awkward it's going to be working through that reconciliation process. We have examples, we have resources such as UNDRIP that I mentioned. We have examples from other colonized nations, from Aotearoa, the New Zealand and Maori communities working on reconciliation, from Canada, who has formalized some of this movement around reconciliation. But we have a lot of work to do in the science community, just as any could be leading those efforts on behalf of all of us, really. Yeah.
Thanks. Alvaro?
And I mean, I think I agree with everything. And I think scientists can really partner with us on making equity a real thing. I always say that equity is both a commitment, but it's also a practice. It can't just be a commitment. A commitment without a practice is an empty promise. So the words diversity, equity, and inclusion, the diversity part, we know how to do better, right? Get people from their first perspectives into the room and have them share their perspective. The equity part, we're not sure what to do there. We acknowledge that people are starting from different places and that those that have less should get more to catch up. But we don't always commit to that practice, right? If a community has less ability to participate in this process, what does it mean to advance equity in that context when we know we have to prioritize what they need a little bit more than everybody else because that's what we want to commit to? And then the inclusion part, we know even less how to do. How do we genuinely include the folks who are at the margins into a decision-making process and a collaboration process to allow those perspectives to actually be genuinely a part of the process that we are in? Whether it's science, whether it's policy, whether it's economics, if we are true around wanting to address the legacy of injustice and commit to equity, we have to build the practices. And the practices, we're not just leaving that to the scientific community to decide how to do. That's where the listening comes in. That's where the partnership comes in. And that's where the genuine interest in wanting to sustain a long-term partnership with the folks that currently are not, there in that part of the conversation. That's where it really matters. So I just encourage really to commit to that practice and help us build the practice of equity.
Great. I want to see if there's any audience questions. Yes. Oh, right. Thanks, Donna.
Thank you. I love everything about this. And I love that we can actually bring this conversation to this space and kind of force that engagement on people. And I just wanted to ask a follow-up question. It was beautiful how you talked about data and the fact that we all make observations and we're all scientists at heart. If we expand the idea of science as to making observations, testing out what works and what doesn't work, and reforming our frameworks and our worldviews around that. That's what everybody does. And so I'm just wondering, is there a means of changing the conversation about what is inclusive about science and just using that terminology that tries to exclude people, and how can we promote this idea that everybody is a data gatherer and everybody is a scientist?
Can I add a little bit to that? I love that question. How do we promote that idea that everybody is a scientist? How do we also promote the idea that every scientist is a human? Also. Is that okay? Yes. Okay.
I can share something real quick. So I like the fact that you mentioned sometimes it just has to be forced, right? It's something that we haven't quite figured out how to do organically. So maybe let's try to force that a little bit. The example that I was giving my colleagues here was that in California, due to some work that we've been able to do, we have forced a partnership between academic institutions doing climate science and community-based organizations that want to participate in that science gathering. So there's a program out of the Strategic Growth Council to fund climate science in California, where we are forcing a little bit of this partnership to come together, to recognize that there is a partnership that could really maximize the opportunity of climate research to advise us and gather information about what we must do to address the climate crisis. So we're trying it out. We're forcing it a little bit and requiring this partnership to take place. We still have a lot to learn about what to do and what's the best practice and what are some of the unintended consequences of that partnership. But I think it's a good start because it's training us on doing something in a way that we haven't done in the past and requiring the scientists to be a little bit more community, and for the community to acknowledge the scientists as, hey, you also don't have all the answers, but that's why we want to partner with you to try to figure out how to get there.
And I hope you don't mind, Alvaro. I just want to add that AGU is a partner with the Strategic Growth Council so that AGU scientists can learn how to do this community-based approach and partner with communities. So if you're interested in being part of that effort, there's a possibility. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I'll just add a couple small thoughts. I think about this all the time. I think about our processes that we use to test the rigor of our science, such as the peer review process. And there's so many areas where we can be adapting the system and the culture of science the way we see it here. I always wonder, what would a culturally appropriate peer review process look like? If I was monitoring water in Alvaro's community, I'd like that community member to be a part of that peer review process. And I imagine that my data would be under very rigorous review in that case on account of the accountability they hold to the land there, which you also spoke of. That's just one. And I think about opportunities where I I did a global systematic review on climate research studies, and it was really interesting to see collaborative and participatory studies that were including community members as co-authors. They had contributed that knowledge, they had contributed that data, and made decisions and helped with that analysis, adding context to that analysis, and they were co-authors on those papers. They still held a level of ownership and governance in that science research. Those are just two small examples of ways that I think we could bring that in that would not only it would also strengthen the scientific integrity of that work. I believe it would strengthen the quality of that work, the quality of that data, along with the cultural integrity. I just see there's many opportunities where what we uphold as good principles of integrity within our culture aren't aligning with scientific integrity. Why not bring those together? And that's something that we can do as scientists, as human beings, regardless of what background we're coming from.
Raj, we have time for one brief last question or some wrap-up comments if you'd like.
All right. I think I'd like to ask each of you to wrap us up, take us home. If we walked away, if you want people to walk away from this with one thing, what would that one thing be?
I've been using this a lot. I think the one thing is that we all have to approach this work around climate change, around equity, and around justice. It's been mentioned here before with humility, but then also with an acknowledgement that it takes an ecosystem. We're all part of this ecosystem, and we all have contributions to make to saving our species. One way or another, the planet is going to be there regardless of what it looks like, but we might not be part of that future. And I think that the climate crisis is creating a tremendous opportunity for us to reimagine the way that we relate to each other and that we relate to the ecosystem that we live in. So taking that kind of approach and thinking about what is our role to play in the ecosystem and what is the role of our communities to play in the work that you do, humility and acknowledging that we all have a role to play in that future. So that's my takeaway for today.
Thank you.
Come to our Native Science to Action sessions on Thursday, because what you'll find and what I see, what gives me a lot of hope and should give all of us hope, is that all of the tools and resources we need are already here. They're within us. They're within these amazing participatory technologies and methodologies that we have in our practice, within these human rights and indigenous and community rights and social justice frameworks. We have examples of good policy, examples of wise practices that we just need to learn from and to apply. I would ask that we make a choice to be good human beings, to be good ancestors, and to make an intergenerational commitment in the work that we do.
So I would like to build on all of that. How many in the room actually teach? Okay. So I want to talk about the methodology and pedagogy of hope. Teaching is actually a pedagogy of hope. And our research is a methodology of hope. Just think about who you teach. If you taught in a way that this collaboration is normal and it's normative, they will leave that classroom thinking precisely that we need to have humility, we need to engage. My own expertise is important, but not sufficient, that I need to collaborate. And some of the interesting evidence we have about the millennials is, yes, they're all like this, together alone, but they're also very collaborative. And they actually don't out each other. They don't out each other. They sort of protect one another. And they have a profound commitment to the environment. We have empirical evidence indicating that. So we have a wonderful audience to develop a methodology of hope with. So they walk into a community and they've done remote sense data using satellites and using models. And we asked them, now could you please explain this to the community? Can you put your graphs up? Can you put your images up? And can you explain it to them? And ask them, is this how they're experiencing precipitation? Is this how they're experiencing temperature? And it is fascinating how the concept of precipitation is then expanded. Just precipitation, right? Between snow and rain, and what rain actually means to people. So it's stunning that if we normatize this in our teaching and in our research, we're actually developing a methodology of hope. It's not some loose feeling that we're talking about. We're talking about a systematic approach where peer review includes the fact that you can see the whites of the eyes of the people who are reviewing your work, which, by the way, is how it began at Edinburgh when we started doing peer review. It was precisely that. You could see the whites of the eyes of the people who were being critical and who were giving you constructive suggestions for your work. So I think really the methodology of hope is there. We just need to construct it with our students. And I think that's a powerful tool and access that we have, all these young people with bright ideas that surround us.
And on that notion of hope and being good ancestors, I'd like to ask you to join me in thanking the panel. And if you'd like to keep talking, behind the blue wall, there's an opportunity to interact more with the panelists on an informal basis. Thank you very much.